You might imagine that Whitman, the war poet, would be an opponent to war, someone appalled by war, rejecting war, a la Melville in the Melville war poems that we've read. But interestingly, Whitman has an entirely different take on the world war. He actually quite vociferously supported it. He was, by the time of the war, an abolitionist, although in some of his early years, he has some pretty reprehensible ideas about race that he articulates in some of his newspaper writing. But like many whites who grew to understand the horror of slavery and the hypocrisy of slavery, Whitman was a convert to abolitionism and supported Lincoln and the war. And like Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, he came to see the war as sort of a necessary price to be paid, a sort of divine retribution for the horrors of hundreds of years of slavery. And that is why even though he had firsthand experience as a nurse of the war, even though he saw firsthand the horrors of the death of thousands of young men, and in fact, we believe 700,000 men died in the Civil War, and at least half of them, and by some expert accounts, more than half in the hospitals after the battles. In other words, died of their injuries after the battle, not on the battlefield. And Whitman saw a lot of that firsthand as a volunteer nurse. He wrote letters for the soldiers. He kept them company. He wrote letters to their families when they died. In one of his letters to a friend, he notes with horror the stacks of amputated arms and legs outside the tents, which seemed more like butcher shops to him than hospitals. And for all his understanding of firsthand of the horrors of war, he ultimately came to believe that it was a heroic sacrifice that unified the nation. And so in this poem Reconciliation, one of the ones I've assigned you can really see this idea of these men who fought each other as enemies being equals and both being part of a cause that results in a carnage that ultimately the nation must move beyond. So this idea of these men sacrificed to purge the nation of slavery so that the nation can be reconciled and moved on. Something I'm not sure we could safely say happened in Whitman's lifetime. Some people would argue it hasn't happened to this day. But what's powerful, in Whitman's mind, it was happening. And in Whitman's mind, it validated the deaths of these hundreds of thousands of men. It validated the carnage. And we get, not for the first time in Whitman's war poetry, a reference to a kiss. And at least one other of the poems I've assigned you, there's an important kiss. But in this case, it's the kiss of an enemy for his dead foe. And so that kiss of equality, that kiss of love, that kiss of reconciliation, that's the dominant experience that Whitman wants to project about war. And you hear that in the other poems that you're looking at, and you'll see it most profoundly in his poems about the death of Lincoln. Okay, hope this gives you a little bit of guidance as you think about Whitman as a war poet. See you in Blackboard.